time when the crowd starts to arrive. I appreciate you folks being here early. I'm Lee Mueller with the Forum Committee. I want to give you a couple of brief announcements before we turn it over and get started. The Forum Committee is a member committee with no direct affiliation with the association. It's not one of the association committees. We try to bring subjects of interest and concern, and occasionally a group like the Vision Committee has a great idea, and we help. So, a couple of items of business. The exits on these two walls, bathrooms across the way. Are there any announcements that folks want to make? I'll make one. Our August forum will be by the North Sonoma Coast Fire Protection District with an update on how bad the fire season looks, what we've been doing and working, and some new equipment and other things. So it'd be nice to see some of you at that one as well. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Christine, or to Mary. Mary's going to come up and move on with this. So.
Welcome everyone. I'm Mary Allender and I'm chair of the Vision Committee. This is a Vision Committee with Forum event. I want to first thank the Forum Committee and especially Lori and Lee, who are, as you probably know, some of the best volunteers any community could ever have, and they make it easy to work with a forum and to sponsor this. Also, Lori, amongst other things, was a founder of the Vision Committee back in 2003, so it all comes around. As you probably know, in 2014 and 2015, the Vision Committee sponsored the Sea Ranch 50th birthday celebration of nearly 50 events that went from dancing on the beach with Laura. Sorry, I'm absolutely blanking. With dancing on the beach with Anna. To virtual 10-mile-long potluck that 993 Sea Ranchers joined in, to our free 3 Kronos Quartet concerts of the Sea Ranch song, composed by Alexandra Veverlov. Today we have many projects underway, and we invite you to join us next Saturday, July 14th, from 4 to 5 p.m. at the Hotspot for the second of our 3 summer get-togethers. Chris Howard, our Sea Ranch Director of Security, will bring a Sea Ranch patrol car and explain what every security officer can provide to help with both minor problems or major emergencies. On August 11th, geologist Tom Cochran will explain the San Andreas Fault as we stand directly on it at the hotspot. Vision's next major project is to create a booklet, both printed and for the web, aimed at new and potential Sea Ranchers to better understand what makes Sea Ranch so special and both the joys and the responsibilities of ownership. The Vision Committee's purpose is to, quote, promote the concepts and ideals of the Sea Ranch Association as defined by our governing documents through active education programs. We studied those governing documents, still vital to our integrity since our founding in 1964. It hit us with great clarity that the protection of our core values is the CC&Rs, our covenants, conditions, and restrictions. One man wrote those, Reverdy Johnson. To tell us a bit about Reverdy, I would like to introduce the architectural historian, Christine Pryman. Christine has served as a museum curator, and also for the last 30 years, She worked as a journalist, as an architecture and urban planning critic. Her most recent book is Shaping the Healthy Community. Christine and her husband Michael are now full-time ranchers, but even when she could only be here part-time, Christine volunteered. She continues to be a valuable member of both the Vision and Archives Committee. Thank you, Christine.
Okay, are we good? Okay. Given that I'm such a relative newcomer, 2011, to the Sea Ranch, many people here are probably wondering what I'm doing up here. And I'm feeling a sense of wonder about it all myself. Reverdy Johnson is a seminal figure in how this place developed and sustains itself. How can I possibly know enough to grasp his accomplishments here? It's a good question. My only answer is that in 2014, I interviewed Reverdy Johnson on behalf of the Archives Committee's Oral History Program. He was patient with my naive questions, rigorous as only an attorney can be in his responses, and generally intent on setting his part of the record straight. I'll try to do the same today. Reverdy Johnson has described himself as a dirt lawyer. In today's culture, that could mean one whose practice is defined by non-disclosure agreements, influence peddling, and catch-and-kill arrangements with the tabloids. But Reverdy Johnson was not being metaphorical. By dirt, he meant the real thing. At the beginning of his legal career, he became smitten by real estate law because one, this is him speaking, could be close to the land, dealing with a tangible subject matter and addressing practical problems, as he told a Sea Ranch audience in 2008 when he accepted a special recognition award from the Sea Ranch Association. It's curious that someone born in New York City in 1937, who attended public schools in suburban New Jersey until age 16, formed a desire to be close to the land, because neither of those locations display the earth in an elemental sense. The summer Reverdy turned 17, however, he started working on a dairy farm in western New York State. As he told me, for my senior year in high school, I went to Mount Hermon School in western Massachusetts. The school was founded by the late 19th century evangelist Dwight L. Moody and included a work program for all students. Mount Hermon then had a large dairy operation, and I happily worked on the 5 a.m. milking crew. Reverdy lived and labored with this farm family for numerous summers and remains very close to them today. That work and my farm father shaped my interest in the land, he said. Reverdy attended Harvard College and received his degree from Harvard Law School in 1963. Then he headed west. In San Francisco, he joined the firm of Brobeck, Flager, and Harrison. There, his mentor, Whit Budge, had a client named Oceanic Properties, a subsidiary of Castle and Cook. Founded in 1851 by agents of missionaries, Castle and Cook gained its economic and political power in the sugar industry in Hawaii and became one of Hawaii's so-called Big Five corporations. But after World War II, an increasingly restive labor force made the industry more problematic in Hawaii. The corporation had lots of land and began to shift operations into developing it. Oceanic Properties was constituted as the development arm. With success in Hawaii, Oceanic began looking for stateside property. This is Reverdy speaking. Oceanic had contracted with the Olsen brothers for the purchase of what was then Delmar Ranch in 1962 or early 1963. And planning for its use and development was just starting. In late 1963, Whit asked me to work with him on the project for Oceanic. I was happy to do so, although until I drove up the coast to walk the land the following weekend, I had no inkling of the magnitude of the assignment or the likely creative experience it would entail. It was on that weekend that he first met architect Bill Turnbull, who, as a member of the MLTW firm, was scouting the site for what would become Condo 1. That meeting initiated a friendship that would span 34 years. This is what Reverdy and Bill Turnbull saw when they explored the site. Go back to the one before. Okay, this is south looking north, Byler and Black Point. You can see the hedgerows. There's no Condo 1, there's no lodge, there's nothing but that little barn that's still in the meadow down there that people use for weddings occasionally. Okay, next. This is looking south. You can see the big old white barn and sort of see the Olson Ranch House, and that's it. The site was overgrazed then, wide open with tremendous view sheds. The realization that taking animals off the land would allow the vegetation to grow explosively was not fully grasped at that point. Turnbull was part of the group Al Bokie was gathering to develop a plan for what was tentatively called at that point the North Coast Ranch. Bokie, an architect who'd studied Newtown developments in Scandinavia, was in charge of the project for Oceanic. He had selected Lawrence Halpern, a landscape architect with whom he'd already worked on a new town in Hawaii, to lead a team that included experts in architecture, landscape architecture, engineering, graphic design, specialists in ecology, forestry, soil science, watersheds, wind, and sun patterns. At Al's request, according to Reverdy, Witt and I joined the group not just as observers, but as active participants. Witt had other commitments on his time, and I soon became the sole lawyer in the group. By today's standards, the gestation period was exceedingly short. The purchase of Del Mar Ranch was closed in February 1964. The first lot in the Sea Ranch was sold in August 1965. The intention for the Sea Ranch was idealistic, to place people on the land while retaining as much of the natural experience as possible. But it was at heart a real estate development, and that required an attorney who could translate planning concepts into the realities of land use regulation, whether public under zoning and subdivision ordinances, or private by way of restrictive covenants. Reverdy remembers this planning period as a golden time. Everyone was getting along, trying to figure out how to do a good thing. We all contributed, although of course you knew your expertise. And back then there could be collaboration between the private and public sectors. We worked with Sonoma County. By analogy, what Oceanic was asking Reverdy to do was to take the designer's Declaration of Independence and write the Constitution, governing structures, rules, processes. For example, as Reverdy explained, the developer had to have the capability to begin with a small project. When the TSR restrictions started, they only applied to Unit 1. But there then had to be a process by which units could be annexed and subject to the restrictions. The retention by the developer to make design changes to the plan was critical. You have to test the market if you're going to sell property to the public. The golf course is a perfect example. Real estate brokers said we had to have one. In early plans, there was the golf course in Unit 3. As planning moved up the course, so did the golf course, unit by unit. But there was really no demand. Finally, 9 holes were built at the north end with the provision for 9 more. On a more specific level, Reverdy said a central goal with the CC&Rs was to give the architect the freedom to be creative on the site. The document, for example, didn't contemplate that everything would be redwood siding. On May the 10th, 1965, Reverdy filed his masterpiece, his own declaration, a declaration of restrictions, covenants, and conditions, now known as the CC&Rs. According to an essay by Jer Skibbons, the document was 111 pages. Reverdy was 28 years old. 1965 was a big year for Reverdy. In that year, he hired Charles Moore and Bill Turnbull of MLTW to design a weekend house, the first individually commissioned house on the Sea Ranch. Turnbull subsequently designed an addition in 1973. It remains an iconic structure. Next. And it's what we published and won numerous awards. This is a slide that Reverdy gave me showing Charles Moore and Bill Turnbull considering the siding of the Johnson House in 1965. Charles looks pretty skinny here. Okay, next. This was the view from the Johnson House in the 1960s. Reverdy recalls that when the house was built, you could see all the way to Point Arena. Next. These slides are courtesy of Jim Allender, and I can't thank him enough for going to the trouble of giving them to me. This is the exterior of the Johnson House, which Donlan in his book calls a tent in the forest, I think. Next. This is the interior in the central space. This is a little dimmer, but the other side of the central space. The house expresses the Sea Ranch ethos of the time. Small footprint, 585 square feet, minimal budget. The walls are painted plywood. Yet the spatial definition belies these restrictions. The plan centers on an open octagon under a pyramidal roof. Walls are supported by peeler poles and pierced by cutouts that reveal sort of one enclosure nesting inside another. More informal spaces for kitchen, dining, and sleeping are formed around the octagon by elongating the roof as necessary, so it's not a completely symmetrical pyramid. Skylights admit sunlight into the edges of the house. Next. Not all of Reverdy's time at TSR was spent on lawyering and home building. Here he and Pamela Johnson are hiking on the Sea Ranch. This image ran in Sports Illustrated in 1966. That this photo appeared in this publication is kind of mind-boggling if you think about Sports Illustrated today, and is a tribute to the excellent PR skills of Marion Conrad, who marketed the Sea Ranch in the early days. This is from the ICO, July 12, 1974. Reverdy ready to take to the water with his daughter in the annual float down the South Fork, staged by what was called the Wallowa River Travel Association. Next. Reverdy's service to the Sea Ranch did not end with the CC&Rs. Here he addresses the midwinter meeting of TSRA on the subject of Proposition 20, which ushered in the Coastal Commission in the early 1970s. As I recall from quotes in this, which appeared, I think, in Soundings, he was sort of optimistic that things were going to work out okay at that point. In 1972 and 73, Reverdy wrote the specific plan for the Sea Ranch in response to a change in state law. For the first time, he said, we make concrete the remainder of the development plan for the project. And in 1984-85, Reverdy was a member of what was called the Professional Consulting Group. Okay, this is where I'm going to need, okay, I'll identify the ones I know. Okay, that's Charles Moore and Al Bokie, and this is Larry Hopper from behind, and Joseph Escherick, and Bill Turnbull, and Reverdy Johnson. Who were the other guys?
Okay, next to me on my left
Yeah.
is Hideo Sasaki.
Hideo Sasaki, okay.
Next to Bill, not exactly sure who that is. Ronald McDonald is in the middle. Fellow who's shaking hands is Jim Burns.
Okay,
And then you've got Joe Escherick and Larry.
okay, good, thank you. Here's another site during the group's gathering. We know these guys. That's Charles Moore, Al Bokie, and Reverdy. This group 20 years after the founding of the Sea Ranch, this is 1985 then, the group was tasked with examining how the Sea Ranch was evolving and what issues confronted members as build-out continued and the forest grew and grew. In their final report, a key recommendation of the group was for a long-term environmental plan with landscape management a prime focus. This is Reverdy in 2010 with Don and Linden. Due to his integral role in the Sea Ranch for many years, Reverdy's expertise on Sea Ranch history is broader than the legal code. He was an important source on the outside pressures, is an important source on the outside pressures that shape the Sea Ranch as we know it today. Modifications in state and county policies, changes in Castle and Cook and Oceanic administrations, vicissitudes in capital markets, transformations in planning, education, and philosophy, revolutions in the environmental movement. So the territory that could be covered today is vast. Fortunately, we have the ideal pair to cover the essence. Frank Bell and Lisa Dundee, who have steady and intimate experience not only with the day-to-day application of the CC&Rs, but how they've played out over time. Frank has been the community manager for the Sea Ranch Association since early 2010. The fact that he looks not at all wizened and withered by this experience may be due in part to the fact that he has a PhD in political science, as well as stints as town manager in Crested Butte and Telluride, Colorado, and 7 years on the Salt Lake Winter Olympics. Lisa has been running TSRA's design review department since 2005, and she's still smiling. Prior to that, since the late 1980s, she was using the Sea Ranch design process in her private architectural practice. Thus, she has a both sides perspective on that process. So that's enough for me. Let the conversation begin. Thank you.
Thanks to the Internal Revenue Code. Castle and Cook, as Christine has mentioned, was then, and for many years, the major landowner, one of the major landowners in Hawaii. They needed to, for a variety of reasons, they needed to start divesting of some of their properties. Technically, if you're selling property as part of a business that you are in, you're going to have to realize the income on that property at the time you sell it. And it's ordinary income. Now, if you are an investor and you sell property, you realize capital gains, not ordinary income. What Castle and Cook did was to form Oceanic Properties as its subsidiary to develop its surplus lands. So it sold the lands to Oceanic at a price that was able to recognize capital gains treatment on the sale. Oceanic, in turn, developed the property, and since it was in the business of doing so, its income was ordinary income to the subsidiary. But you had to have more than, you had to be in the business of developing real estate other than the real estate of your parent. So while Castle and Cook sold the property that became Mililani Town to Oceanic, Oceanic had to be in the business on its own as a developer. Ergo, find some other property not in Hawaii. That's where Al Hoke came into play. He was charged with the responsibility of finding property appropriate for the goals of Castle and Cook through Oceanic.
Now, imagine yourself in 1961 as Al Boki with this charge of finding a development project. You're in a single-engine plane flying over the coast, piloted by Page Maillard, who was one of the great ranch brokers of all time. Knew everybody, knew what the properties were, knew what they were worth, and was the guy to go to. They flew over, and if you're in the role of being Al at this particular moment, you're looking at 5,200 acres over 10 miles of coast that formed a current sheep ranch, and really was the northerly reaches of the last Mexican land grant, Rancho German. You look down and you see this absolutely marvelous, pristine land, but it's not. All this land had been logged. It was all redwoods down to the bluff. Logging took place. After logging, you took out tan oak, took the bark, shipped it out off the dog ports out here, down to San Francisco, and it was that tan oak that bark of the tan oak tree that created the tanning industry, or enabled the tanning industry in San Francisco to develop. You had railroads crossing the meadow, hauling logs up to be dealt with at the mill at the north end. When that all ended, the property transferred into agriculture, but it was cleared. You had grazing, cattle grazing. You had our white barn there was a dairy barn at the outset. It went through cattle grazing with a lot of people involved as owners of the property at various times. It went through bankruptcy more than once. Finally, the Olson brothers out of Annapolis bought the property probably shortly before World War II, if I recall, and turned it into a sheep ranch. Now, the sheep did the job of clearing the land. Whether they preserved it or not is a matter of dispute. But they created the image that you saw from that plane. Now, once you got to the ground, your appetite was whetted all the more. And you decide this is the place that you want to acquire for development. So you take the time, do further due diligence, negotiate with the family, enter into a contract to buy it. There was one brother of the Olsons, I think it was Chester, who had recently died. They had to probate Chester's estate to be able to transfer it to Oceanic. All of that took time, and the sale was not closed until February of 1964. Now, if you're Al, you assemble a planning group of architects, landscape architects, planners, civil engineers, geographers, and of course lawyers. And you charge them with the task of accomplishing conflicting goals: to develop the land that the buying public wants to buy, and yet preserve the beauty of the land, and at the same time, since this is not a charitable enterprise, you've got to make an acceptable return on investment. Now the rest is history. Al Boki, Larry Halprin, Joe Eschrick, Charles Moore, Bill Turnbull, Walter Borelgi, and others met starting in 1963 and in 1964, created the concept that became the Sea Ranch. Now, Alex Budge was the chairman of the board of Castle and Cook in Hawaii. Castle and Cook was represented on the mainland by the firm of Robeck, Flair, and Harrison. Alex's son, Whit Budge, wonderful guy, was a young partner in that law firm that represented Castle and Cook. Al Boke turned to Whit Budge for assistance on the acquisition and development of the Olson Ranch. I joined the firm in 1963, having just graduated from law school 3 months before, and I was assigned to work with Whit. I accompanied Whit as a member of the planning group, and before long took an operational responsibility for the project within the Robeck firm. And you've got to think back for a minute and have the context of what San Francisco was like in 1963. You didn't work 5 days, you worked 5.5 days. In your office, you could sit without a coat on. It wasn't a sports coat, it was a suit coat. If you were going outside of your office, you had to have your suit coat on, and certainly if you're going to meet with a partner in the firm. You went upstairs in 111 Sutter Street in an elevator to the 11th floor. But that elevator was not a self-service elevator. There were no such things. You went in and had an operator, always assistant operator, in running all the elevators. Your secretary wore gloves to the office and a hat. No women were downtown without gloves and hat. Shortly after I got there, blessedly, Saturday morning work was abolished, at least in terms of your expectation to be there. In point of fact, most of the firm continued to work on Saturdays, not just Saturday mornings, as a means of dealing with the level of responsibility that each of the lawyers had. And if the partner was there, you damn well were going to be there working. The economy of this country was expanding at an extraordinary rate in the early 60s. Opportunities abounded for my generation, Don Linden's generation, because we were born in the Depression and there weren't many of us. If you had talent, the world was your oyster, particularly on the West Coast. Elsewhere, the constraints of convention and tradition still ruled. Took some time for the level of activity on the part of business of our generation to reach the responsibility that we had here back in the East. My job was to draft what became the Sea Ranch restrictions, private legislation that would govern the community to be formed. From a legal standpoint, the combination of restricted covenants and what are known as equitable servitudes that constituted the restrictions, they would apply not only to initial purchases, but to all successor owners of the original buyers. The concept was well established in English common law, and in my real property law course in law school, I had learned the requisite underpinnings of such documentation. In this country, restrictive covenants had been employed for a variety of purposes for some years, some beneficial and some not. Prior to World War II, restrictive covenants in suburban projects were used not only to exclude incompatible uses, but also to exclude racial minorities. Whit and I reviewed a whole host of the existing covenants for different projects, including those in effect at Pebble Beach in Monterey County. We found nothing that was an acceptable template. Thus, we had to cut from whole cloth. Whit and I outlined what we needed the document to accomplish. The task of being draftsman fell to me, although Whit wrote the wonderful preamble that eloquently embodies the idealism of both the project and the document. Various provisions of the restrictions are a direct outgrowth of the planning group discussions. Clearly, the division of land into lots and common area. Common area existed in real estate usage since feudal times, but rarely had it become part of the lexicon of real estate development in this country. For marketing purposes, we had to keep the lots as large as possible, but we had to limit the portion of the lot to what we call private area and characterize the balance as restricted private area that had to remain visually indistinguishable from adjacent common area, even though its use was limited to the lot owner. And this has stood the test of time, because you really don't need to use that which is restricted private area. The fact that it is yours, you get a lot of warm comfort about it. But in fact, it has to appear and be treated as common area. Provisions concerning provisions concerning condominium development were included at great length in the restrictions on the assumption of the planning group that it would be possible to develop at a denser level of development that in fact was able to be done. But the condominium form of development would have been much preferable for the cluster type of development that was intended by the planning group. That did not meet the test of time in terms of what the market is and the market was. Thus, the provisions concerning condominium development, the conditions that would dictate condominium development simply didn't happen. From the planning group, there were provisions for control of materials, but more than materials and more than design, potentially color. And we have provisions in the restrictions that say that if you have a subdivision map that has identified on it areas that are designated A, B, or C, that the depth of that color had to be from medium to white, or gray to medium, or more intense at a lower color of white. That never happened anywhere. Pure surplusage in the document, but from a planning standpoint, there was a lot to commend it. If you go back and look at the restrictions, you will see that there are many provisions for development of recreational facilities, including neighborhood facilities that could be funded and would have to be funded by user owners as opposed to by the association. There may have been such and I don't know the status of the airstrip, but that would logically have been a private recreational facility as opposed to a public one. But basically, the provision for affinity groups of owners to build recreational facilities for their own use as opposed to everybody in the association, that never occurred. The restrictions reflected a control on introduced vegetation, and that was very much a function of the recommendations from the planning group. So you will find in the restrictions a limitation on the growth of new plant material on a lot to not more than 8 feet in height, unless it qualifies as indigenous species of plant material specified in an exhibit to the restrictions, a whole list of what is deemed to be indigenous, or in rules that might subsequently be adopted by the design committee. I would have to say that the negative implication of this concept of indigenous species never being more than 8 feet high, I read that to say that if you have vegetation that is less than 8 feet high, it need not be of indigenous species. I don't know how much that's been discussed here, but that's the way I would handle it. There was a rulemaking authority of the design committee. The concept here was get away from a reliance on uninhibited discretion to state as much as possible from a regulatory standpoint what the standards are that are to be applied, so that an owner knows going into the situation what it is that am I going to have to confront and deal with and comply with. All of that was moved from the planning group into the restrictions. Things that we did not cover, but in retrospect, perhaps we should have, although I'm not sure that any provisions that the planning group could have formulated would have been any more acceptable than the absence of the provisions. But the provisions that do not appear are ways in which to manage tree growth and the loss of views on common area and lots. Very, very sensitive issue. In fact, it was not dealt with satisfactorily, if at all, in the restrictions. But picture the difficulties you have enforcing that. And it's not a one-time enforcement. Trees grow. Somehow or other, if you are legislating that someone is to be able to have a particular view, you might be able to protect that view on common area, but you're going to have a lot of difficulty protecting that view over somebody else's lot. But that's an issue that never made it into the restrictions, and then the addressing of it. The expansion, retention, and replacement of hedgerows, not dealt with. Ways in which to deal with major disease infestation of tree species, not dealt with in part because it couldn't be conceived of at that time. Driving up the coast yesterday, Jenny and I were stunned to look at the amount of deforestation that is occurring as a result of disease. And we got it here as well. Now, no real estate, one other thing that we did not properly do in the restrictions. client said, let's not make it easy to amend these restrictions. I said, fine, there's an easy way to do that. And it did provide at the outset that you could only amend restrictions by having consents to the amendments signed, notarized, and recorded for each lot owner. Now, the practical effect of that is that there are no amendments made. Fortunately, we encountered a situation in the early days that told us we need to change that. You will recall that basically at the corner of Moonraker and the highway, there is one lot that has direct access to Highway 1. That's the only lot in the Sea Ranch. And that was a lot on which Joe Eschrick's firm designed the house for Ned Westover, who was the initial employee of the Sea Ranch in charge of pulling together everything necessary to create the project physically. Ned was a retired contractor out of Los Angeles that Al knew and brought him up here. Ned Westover knew Matt Sylvia down there, told Matt Sylvia, let's go up to the North Coast, and Matt said, you betcha, here we go. When Ned retired from working at the Sea Ranch, we had a house with access from the highway. We also needed to have a dock on the property. And whose name I momentarily forgot. Jack Woodruff. Jack was a doctor in, I think, in Santa Rosa. He came over, he took over that house and conducted his practice out of that house for a good number of years. There are two problems with that. But one of the basic ones was that every lot in the Sea Ranch is for strictly residential use other than home employment. That access to the house from the highway was absolutely necessary for Jack Woodruff's purposes as a physician. But we knew we had to change the restrictions as they related to that particular lot in terms of how it could be used. Well, we had put ourselves in a box. So if we sold any more lots before we got the restrictions amended, our problem of getting the restrictions amended was manifoldly increased. So before we had too many individual owners, we amended the restrictions, had everybody sign and notarize the consent to the amendment that first of all took away the requirement of a notarized consent. Then we could have a consent that dealt with Jack Woodruff's lot. That was, if there was any error on the part of, on my part as a function of age and lack of seasoning, that was evidence of it right there. But we solved the problem, and there have been amendments as needed, but the process is one that is now a practical one. No real estate project in this, even in the early 60s, could be developed independently of compliance with public regulation. In our case, the California Department of Real Estate, which was originally charged with making sure that all information with respect to a real estate project was adequately disclosed to buyers. By the mid-60s, however, the Department of Real Estate started to regulate the nature of the project. so that an incremental planned unit development could do some things and not other things. You had to have the authority over the design committee. Any design regulation had to be transferred from the developer to the homeowners association at a point or so in the future, whether governed by years or governed by number of lots, percentage of lots sold. There were a host of other things that the state started to get involved in that made compliance with the regulations significantly more difficult, and theoretically, to protect the buyer, I'm not convinced that that accomplished anything. But we were able to work, my responsibilities took on this compliance activity with respect to the state and all county work. We were able to work constructively with the county and the state so that the goals of the Sea Ranch still could be achieved. Later, state legislation resulting from abuses in other segments of the development industry were retroactively imposed on the operations of homeowner associations, and I'm sure that you've got a much stronger set of ideas on and reaction to that than I did, because most of that was after my time. And of course, under the guise of resource conservation, all development of coastal land in California was subjected to regulation whose purpose was to achieve social goals. But that's another sad tale with which most of you are all too well familiar. Let me make a couple of comments from my vantage point of almost 55 years with this property. I fear that as developers and consultants, we were all a bit naive to assume that the physical environment of the Sea Ranch that we found could be frozen in time. The forces of nature dictate otherwise. It seems to me that the role of the association and its members is to be responsive and adaptive to the changes that will necessarily occur, and not be presumptuous in thinking that change can be outlawed. No private development can exist independently of market forces. Real estate market, financial market. It just doesn't happen. As I mentioned previously, tightly clustered development may be the best for the creation and preservation of common area. But if buyers want single-family detached residences, that's what they're going to get. And as a result, the developer cannot avoid the reality of what the market is requiring. Just think of the number of sites here that were reserved for condominium development, but were later converted to lots for single-family detached houses. When control of an old-line real estate-heavy corporation such as Castle & Cook gets taken over by an investor bent on unlocking the value of its real estate, the dynamics of projects such as the Sea Ranch change. Long-term planning gets sacrificed to short-term needs. Indeed, in many respects, the wisdom of planning and executing large projects over an extended period is, in my mind, now questionable. Finally, there is a natural human tendency to use government, whether public or private, to be more complex than is necessary and to impose by regulation solutions to perceived problems. I have come to the conclusion that government that governs least is that which governs best. Resist the tendency to do something simply because there is a power and authority to do so. I come back to the penultimate paragraph in the preamble to the restrictions. It must be assumed that all owners of property within the Sea Ranch, by virtue of their purchase of such property, are motivated by the character of the natural environment in which their property is located and accept for and among themselves the principle that development and use of the Sea Ranch must preserve that character for its present and future enjoyment of other owners. It is also assumed that those who are entrusted with the administration of the Sea Ranch will discharge their trust in full recognition of that principle, and to the extent consistent therewith, will foster maximum individual flexibility and freedom of the individual. Thank you. Now, I think I am exposed from this point on, is that right?
I, for one, am unarmed. Are you gonna do a 4 o'clock break, or do you want us to talk?
Depends on what you guys were planning on doing originally. We can go a little beyond 4, but people get a little antsy without a
Well,
break.
I've thrown all my notes away, so I'm taking others.
Then why don't we go ahead? I'm not sure what your plan was. So, let's go
Why
ahead and take a
don't we
10-minute break.
stop and come back for a
Let's
couple
do
of
that,
comments
take
from
10
us?
minutes now.
For those of you in the back who might have heard, we're going to take our break now, and about 10 after 4 resume, and we'll go into question and answer and allow these people to converse so that we'll cover some more territory. But in the meantime, do that. When you do come back, I will need you to go over to that microphone sitting over there to ask your question. There are 2 reasons. One is we are videoing this. The second is that I and Reverend have to hear those speaker things. Otherwise, it's hard to hear. And I tell people, speak loudly. Wow, here's my question. And so it doesn't work. So please use that microphone, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Well, I can,
They're going to ask some questions of Reverdy first. Lisa and Frank are going to, and then they'll tell me when you want them to cue.
okay. Well, first I was, what?
Wow.
Turn up your hearing aid. First, I listened. I was spellbound by Reverdy's comments over the last little while. It was really quite remarkable to listen to what these kids at the time did. And what Reverdy told us was that they largely made it up as they went along. That they went and looked at examples, and none of the examples fit the vision that they had, so they just made it up. And here we are, more than 50 years later, living under the same umbrella that they created, largely unchanged. And I think that's a pretty remarkable accomplishment. I look at Lisa and I.
It's a remarkable accomplishment, not just for the planning group, but for the association and its members, because this project is only as good as people will make it themselves.
Well, and I think we'll all admit that this place has attracted an odd and unusual group of people to live here, and that's okay. If we're all kept together, then we're not out causing mischief in the rest of the world. But the remarkable thing to me, Lisa's office, they're frequently the folks that have to say no. Sometimes I do too. It kind of depends on the situation. We always try to get to yes, but sometimes in order to protect what you have to say no. And we do that. It's not always enjoyable, but it happens. But Reverdy made a couple of comments that I want to take just 2 seconds to talk about. The first one was that the CC&Rs were sort of viewed as a constitution. Maybe I misinterpreted your comments just a little bit, but the CC&Rs work a lot like a constitution. And because they have survived the tests of time, the constitutional aspects of them become more clear every day. That it's a framework from which this community is not only governed, but lives. And there are other pieces of the governing documents. It isn't just the CC&Rs. It's the articles of incorporation, it's the bylaws, it's the design manual, and it's the rules. They all kind of go together to make this framework of governance that works. I would love to spend time thinking or talking about, and we don't have time today, but how challenging and maybe a little scary it would have been as a kid 2 years out of law school to figure this out. And I just think it's remarkable. So enough about that. Reverdy mentioned a couple of other things, the challenges of public government on this homeowners association as well as homeowners associations. In general, there are over 50,000 homeowners associations in California. The assembly treats them pretty much all the same, whether they have 10,000 members or 3. And we get, the assembly is increasingly meddling in the affairs of homeowners associations. We get legislation every year. Some of it affects us. Sometimes whatever they're dealing with doesn't affect us because of where we are, not necessarily because we're a homeowners association, but whatever it is they're dealing with just doesn't apply to us. But a lot of things do. And I worry as I look at the assembly of I think there should be an increasing worry that the state of California is truly in the business of more closely regulating the homeowners associations. And that may come to affect us one day. For example, the state is talking about solving the housing issues by creating accessory dwellings on individual properties. If you build a house, you have to build a second house for somebody else, or create a housing fund from which other housing is built. And that's something that is, I hear in legislative circles, is increasingly on the table. That's going to come right into conflict with our CC&Rs. So these are the sorts of things that we try to watch out for. The other issue is how hard it is to change the CC&Rs. Fortunately, we have rules, we have design guidelines, and other sorts of documents that are much easier to amend to fit changing circumstances. But at this stage of the homeowners association development, it's really very challenging to change the CC&Rs. Section 8 of the CC&Rs was removed in 1988 by a vote of the membership, and that's the only time that it's happened since the days they were put together. That section, the removal of that section, allowed for the association to protect its privacy from the lodge and other outside entities. And that's really the only time it's been changed. And with the mandates required to change them, I think it's 75% of all members now, that's a pretty hard bar to climb. So I have questions, but I'd rather have Lisa talk.
Well, it sounds like if the state laws were
Speak into the
to, I'm sorry,
microphone,
it
please.
sounds like if the state laws were to pass about accessory units, that would be what we would be facing, is to have to.
Well, it could be.
Yes.
There are ways, obviously, to lobby the legislature and deal with that. And there are associations that protect our interests in Sacramento. But at the end of the day, state law trumps our CC&Rs. And we need to be careful about that.
Before I start Reverdy, is there anything you would want to say in response to that, or?
Oh, I think you get your lobbyists and get to work.
Right.
I mean, there's absolutely no justification for accessory unit legislation to apply to a project such as this. And you've got to make that message clear to get that message clear to every assemblyman and senator in Sacramento. And they should be receptive, because you really, and I might also say the governor, the purpose of that expansion of permissible dwelling units is to take care of a very real crisis in housing for workforce in California, primarily workforce, but a little bit more than that. We haven't got that issue up here. So I don't know why you should be tarred with the same brush that is applied against everybody else. It makes no sense. And I don't think, and there's no reason why the C-Ranch has to be treated as unique in that regard.
That's true, and I'm not suggesting that that's something that is happening today, but it's certainly something that those conversations are out there, and we're doing everything we can to stay on top of it.
I can provide you actually with a small scale example of that. I think it was about 5-8 years ago where the state was trying to make a law that prohibited HOAs from prohibiting artificial grass as a way of dealing with the drought. And so we did do exactly that. We wrote the governor, we wrote our representatives, and we said, we are a community that uses natural, native landscape that does not need to be irrigated, and hence it was effective. So that was an example, small scale. My question, as it is, as I run the design review office, has to do with the design committee. Of course, the provisions in our CC&Rs are quite unique in the way that our design committee is set up, being, I guess in current day terms, you would call it a firewall between the board of directors and the design committee on many levels.
That's
once
correct.
they are
I
appointed.
agree with that. That is intentional.
That is intentional. I'd like to hear you speak about that, but also that I think there's 4 very powerful words in our CC&Rs that say in their sole discretion, which is really what differentiates or allocates their sort of power in that realm, and the ability to make their own rules. So if you could speak to that just a minute, for a moment, about what caused you to make sure that.
The conclusion that you're reaching, I think, is an accurate one. This is a private organization. People buy into it. If they don't want to be subject to the restrictions, you don't buy here. And those restrictions are intentionally tough when it comes to certain things. And you have a unique situation of a design committee which is appointed by the association, looks to the association for its financial support, but rules the association and its members in terms of any decision-making. Whatever the association wants to do, that's subject to the design committee, puts the association in the same status as any owner, vis-a-vis the ability of the design committee to make those judgments. And like it or not, that was the plan, and I'm hopeful that that is where it is today in its operation.
Can you speak a little bit about the intention, the reasons why it was formed that way? In other words, the thinking behind why you wanted to have the separation in that way?
Well, I trust it should be obvious. If you do not have independence, too many other factors come into play in the decision-making. You had a period of time where the developer was the party that appointed the members of the design committee. We were extraordinarily fortunate in the ownership of the developer, that it did not seek to control individual decision-making by the design committee through control of the members. Now, admittedly, we did set it up in a fashion where the developer had the authority to make all of the judgments with respect to how a property, a subdivision, is developed. That had, the design committee association had no role whatsoever in that, and that was intentional. But once you get past that development point, you really, the integrity of the decision-making process is at risk if it does not respect the authority of those members of the design committee.
I guess I'd like to hear from the membership.
Anybody have questions, please use the microphone.
And if nobody wants to talk, we'll just keep talking.
Reverdy, I would be interested in you commenting on the potential for conflict between your group and Oceanic. In the development, they had a motive of making profit. Did they see any of the things that you felt were essential to be in the CC&Rs sort of contrary to that ultimate aim of theirs?
No, sir, but for a different reason. Al Boki was the developer. He was part of the planning group. He led the planning group. He didn't tell the planning group what to do, but he led it. Now, he had 100% support from Fred Simpich, who was the president of Oceanic, who wanted no direct involvement except through Al. So we had no, we were working for the developer, we were paid by the developer, but the developer had no agenda that was independent of what Al wanted to accomplish.
How did you, as the development was starting out and as you began to sell lots, how did you communicate with lot buyers the responsibilities and the obligations they were about to assume by buying property here?
What you are basically asking is describe the interface between the real estate broker and the seller and the buyer. And we had an outstanding, well, we had sort of an in-house broker to start with by the name of Emmett DeMoss, who was and remains a very close friend of mine. His role was as an employee of Oceanic, and he held the broker's license for Oceanic. And that was only a transition into a more active sales program. Oceanic brought in as an independent contractor a super salesman and very difficult guy by the name of Bill Pischel, P-O-E-S-C-H-L. I think he acted responsibly, but he was not as subject to the control of the developer as the developer might have wished in certain instances. But it was he and his people who had to be the communicators to the buyer, and had to make sure that the buyer understood what the goals were of the project, and that that buyer was comfortable with living with the restrictions. So I can't say it was a perfect process, but I know that that was the necessary way, and the only way in which Oceanic had any real direct communication with the buyers.
Yeah, that certainly is one of our challenges today, now that there are 2,200 of us.
Yeah.
Is in an active and healthy real estate market, how do we communicate to people the obligations and responsibilities they're taking on by buying here in a world where it's much more difficult to have those communications.
Well, it's easy to communicate after you know who the person is, and you know that when the deed gets recorded. It's a little late in the process to start the communication, however. So I can only sympathize with you that it's an issue that requires a process that is probably better than what you've got now.
Yes, I agree.
That's a large charge of what the vision committee is all
Yes.
about, is our host for this.
We are working on it, but it's a difficult task.
When did it occur to the planning committee that the original model, that is the condominium and the cluster housing, was not going to fly from a marketing standpoint? I have to imagine there must have been some real tense moments at that time.
The planning committee had completed its work before sales started. You had one condominium, condominium one, signature